Hello. My Tlingit name is Ichindu. I'm Yunyedi, and I am granddaughter of the Ak Kwan. My English name is Lillian Petershoare. Another part of my identity is that I am a Forest Service employee and have been one for nearly 15 years. And it is in that capacity that I am so honored and humbled to address you. And I'd like to say that I deeply wish that Don Bremner with the Southeast Alaska Intertribal Fish and Wildlife Commission, that Carol Hedlund with the University of Alaska Southeast Egan Library, and that Joanne Wita, a former employee with Goldbelt Corporation, I wish they were standing beside me right now, because the theme of what I'm going to address has very much to do with partnerships, and they have been the Forest Service's partners along with the elders who have guided us with this project. I'm going to tell you about a project called Ha'atayi Hakustiyiksiti. This is a project that it is so fitting to announce the latest phase of this project here in Sitka. And the reason why it's so fitting is that back in 1978, there was a meeting here in Sitka, and it involved cultural leaders. And these cultural leaders recognized that there was such a wealth of information regarding our traditional foods. And they very much wanted that information to be preserved. This had gotten back to the Forest Service. And the Forest Service responded, and they responded with a recruitment of Richard Newton. Richard Newton was a retired Forest Service employee living in Juneau, and they asked him to come back and work for the agency as a Tlingit historian and to interview the elders so that this important information regarding our traditional foods would be documented. And he had some help. So when I talk about partnerships, it's really fascinating to think about working together, partnerships, then and now, and how that theme of working together has carried throughout the course of this. And so I'd like to give you a little bit of history regarding that. Dick Newton and Madonna Moss did a number of interviews in the late 1970s and the early 80s. And one of the elders that they interviewed is here at this conference. Her name is Matilda Gamble. There were numerous interviews that were recorded on tape cassettes. And in 1984, there was a wonderful publication, The Subsistence Lifeway of the Tlingit. And then it was republished again several years later. And then, I'd say about 2.5, 3 years ago, we looked at the publication and we thought we wanted to get it out into the communities again. And we worked with the Southeast Alaska Intertribal Fish and Wildlife Commission and with Goldbelt Corporation and Central Council. And we held some planning meetings, and it was so wonderful because the people that we were working with were of very like minds. We said, we don't want to be in the driver's seat. We want the elders to lead us. If this project is going to have integrity, it has to have the elders being in the driving seat. So we essentially became the worker bees. And we met with the elders, and we had a workshop soon after celebration so that we could have greater participation. And something that we thought we were going to do was we were simply going to reprint The Subsistence Lifeway of the Tlingit and then work on a sequel. Well, early on in these meetings, our elders very firmly but very lovingly told us that no, we needed to work on revising that publication. And the first step in that revision was to examine that title. And there were really strong, passionate feelings that were conveyed about that word subsistence. And we got our marching orders. Well, at the time, in public affairs, there was a feeling that you just don't change a title of a book. So we needed to problem solve. And Joanne Wida said, how about if we create a videotape and we video the elders talking about this word subsistence and how inadequate it is, and how about if we send that to Madonna Moss? And so a videotape was born, and it was sent to Madonna, and Madonna viewed the videotape, and she wrote this most eloquent email back, which I was able to take to public affairs and to my supervisors. And Madonna essentially said that the elders were in agreement. There was unanimity between them, and that if the Forest Service was going to demonstrate that it could listen to Alaska Native peoples, we needed to change that title. So consequently, we got approval to proceed. And we worked, we had several meetings, Gold Belt sponsored them, elders came, we had working committees, and we crafted a new title. And I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the elders who helped with this. If you look at the acknowledgments to the first revision, there's 3 pages that talk about the process. And I really encourage you to do that, because I'm only going to be able to acknowledge the elders who helped, who are at this clam conference. There were so many who contributed. And so please, if you're interested, take the time to read that acknowledgement. Here in this room, I see Selena Everson, who helped. Her articulation of subsistence and how its inadequacies was so powerful that we ended up using that in a video that we presented in the Washington office the year the Museum of the Native American was celebrated its grand opening. And we had a grand opening in the Yates building for the Hall of Tribes, and we used Selena's excerpt. Nora Dauenhauer, her help in updating the spellings was just tremendous. Marie Olson assisted in updating those spellings and guiding us. At first we thought we were just changing the title, and the elder said, no, there's more work to be done. We have to look at the spellings throughout the book. We have to look at the use of the word subsistence throughout the book. We need to rewrite the perspective section because it reads like the Tlingits live in the past. So the elders truly did guide us through this revision. Also at this conference are Lillian Austin, who helped us, Percy and Ed Coons, who helped us, David Katzig, Ray Wilson, and many others. We were just so blessed to have that partnership between the elders and the staff of the partners who worked together. We have very fond memories of this time of working together. Then there was also the partnership of working with Madonna Moss as co-author and working with Myrna Allen as daughter to Richard Newton to make sure that they were on board with everything. And Madonna was so great. I'm sure she had a busy schedule as a faculty instructor, but she took time to look at and work with me in terms of rewriting that perspectives chapter and looking at words like subsistence. And so it was so appreciated to have that collaboration. That collaboration was really key. And so we worked on revising the publication, and we were able to release it. And a very important part of this was that we very much felt that the elders who initiated this project back in Sitka, back in the 1970s, and that our ancestors were very much guided by a desire to preserve this information for future children. So we thought carefully about this with regard to distribution. We wanted this publication to be a complementary publication, and we wanted it to be something that would be beneficial and help promote the language. And so when we distributed it, we sent classroom sets to middle school, high school, and colleges, to Tlingit language groups. They received classroom sets, to public libraries. We really wanted this to get out into the communities, to the tribes, to the ranger districts. And then when we talk about partnership, we've talked about partnership with the elders, partnership with our partners, and we have partnership within the Forest Service. Steve Kessler, who works in subsistence, came up with a wonderful idea that it didn't take long for us to grab hold of that idea. And he said, Lillian, this book needs to have a CD. And took that information back to our partners and to our elders, and we thought, why not have a CD where we have the terms that are in the glossary. In the publication, there's a written glossary, and it has the Tlingit names, the common names, and the scientific names. Well, why not have a CD that will teach our children and the students of Tlingit language how to say those berry terms, those fish terms, those wildlife terms. And so the revision came to incorporate this CD. And it was so wonderful. K2 helped us with this. And they did this at very minimal cost to make this project affordable. Dr. Soboleff gave the introduction. Florence Shakely and David Katzig do the instruction. So we're very happy that this was a part of the revision. So we went through this revision, and then less than a year later, we had, gosh, I think it was like 3,000 copies of this publication. It was quite a few. I don't remember exactly, but they were gone. And then we had to order another set. So then we thought, well, let's update this a little further. So the latest edition has more photographs of the elders, and it has the letter from Myrna Allen that is so eloquent. She's the daughter of Dick Newton. And so it was really wonderful. It's really been a work in progress, and now I get to the point where I get to share something that is just really special. When we revised the publication, the Forest Service made a commitment that we would take these tape cassettes and we would provide UAS with a copy, because previously they had been at UAF and they had been at the Juneau Ranger District. And we thought we need to get them available in a very accessible way, like a university setting that has interlibrary loan. And so we partnered with the University of Alaska Southeast Egan Library and the commission, the Southeast Alaska Intertribal Fish and Wildlife Commission, and you see their logos, and each of us agreed to pay a third of the cost to get these archived. And this was really important because if you think about it, these tape cassettes are 25 years old or more. So they were in desperate need of being archived. Otherwise, these voices would be lost to us. And so we contracted with UAF, and the Oral History Project agreed to take on the work, and we did this work was done this past year. And so we really pushed to get 2 runs of the CDs available for this clan conference, because we wanted to be able to share this with you. And now I know that additional runs are being made, and we brought copies of this, and at yesterday's market we had an informational table where you could listen to these CDs. I wanted to share that the 3 partners, the Southeast Alaska Intertribal Fish and Wildlife Commission, the University of Alaska Southeast, and the Forest Service, none of us unfortunately are in a position to make these available for sale. We're just not set up to do that. But I did want to share that you can access these through interlibrary loan from UAS Southeast. And also, if you are a student of UAS or a faculty person there, you can go to the media department, take some CDRs with you, talk to our little midget, and ask him to run you a set. And they will gladly do that at no cost. So just wanted to let you know that this resource is available to you. And if you have had time to look at this publication, either the original or the revisions, you know that it's a real jewel. Well, this real jewel is only a small subset of what is contained in the actual interviews. And I might add that we had a delightful occurrence in January. I received an email from the National Archives, and they didn't know we were working on this project, and they said, we have this list of tape cassettes, and it has something to do with the subsistence lifeway of the Tlingit, but we don't know if it's a complete set. Could you look over our list? Well, not only was it a complete set, it had one more interview that we didn't know existed. And it wasn't in the Appendix 1 index of all the interviews. And it was the one with Ruby Jackson. So we were so delighted to acquire that and add that to the collection. That interview happens to be in English. And what is a particular note is that Ruby is Dr. Walter Soboleff's sister. And in the course of the interview, she shares about their upbringing and their childhood memories on Killisnoo. And so it's just a real pleasure to listen to, and you get a real sense of history for Angoon, for the family, and for that time period. So that is just a real delight to be able to now put this out so that it is available for people to use. So I hope that I have conveyed the sense of sheer pleasure that we had in working together and the true sense of collaboration, and that if the project has integrity, it has integrity because the elders guided us. So it's just a huge gunashish to all the elders who were involved in this project. They really made it happen, and they were the ones who very lovingly and sometimes firmly prodded us on. Thank you.
So what I wanted to do is, basically this talk was designed to show different ways that the Forest Service has been trying to work with Native people on Prince of Wales Island to provide interpretive and recreation opportunities in regards to rock art sites. And there have been a lot of different ways that we've done it, but or a couple of different ways that we've done it, but they have all been in partnership with Craig and Klawock tribal governments and representatives of those governments and members on Prince of Wales Island. See if the sites I want to talk about are a place we call Pictograph Cave on one of the outer coast of one of the outer islands, and a place called Shipley Bay on Kosciuszko Island, which is actually a pretty well-known site, and then the Dry Pass petroglyphs, which are on also on Kosciuszko Island up near the north end of it. Just to show you a little bit about Pictograph Cave is a pictograph site, a painting site, where red ochre pictographs on the interior of a limestone cave in a high-energy beach on the outer island. The petroglyphs at Shipley Bay that we call 49 PET 209 is just sort of a code that the state uses to identify archaeological sites, and so that's the number that we've been referring to it by. And this is an intertidal site. Boulders and small rocks down to bowling ball size on a beach, about a half a mile long stretch of beach in a place called Shipley Bay. And the third site is at Sutter Creek at Dry Pass near the village of Chican it's actually on Kosciuszko Island, but right across Dry Pass from Prince of Wales Island. These are all sites that are fairly well known. The first thing that we did in terms of, struggling, my motivation in going to these places was that they are all well known. They're all in danger of destruction. We wanted to record them thoroughly to make sure that we had them documented before something happened to them. And in doing that, we needed help with figuring out what they meant, and we needed help in doing the actual recording. We needed bodies to come out and help us. So the Forest Service has a program called Passports in Time, which brings volunteers to work on historic and archaeological projects with Forest Service specialists. And so the first attempt we made was in 2000 at Pictograph Cave, and we brought together representatives from different perspectives. We had in the back there, you recognize Steve Langdon from the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And Steve, through his long association with Native people on Prince of Wales Island and his ethnographic and archaeological work, was a kind of a liaison between the project and the folks on the island. John Rowan there is the carver and traditional culture teacher at the Klawock School District. And John had been out to the site before and seen it before and had thought about it and talked to the elders about it. And so John came along on the project. The other guy's a rock art specialist that works out of, he's a Forest Service archaeologist from the Washington and Oregon area. And he's worked on Columbia Basin rock art. He works in Europe in the caves, the Pleistocene cave paintings, and he's a very, very well-known specialist in recording rock art. So we brought a bunch of different people together to bring their expertise to bear on the project. And we put everybody out in the field. And then, of course, there's Bill Demert, and Bill is Taquan AD clan, which is associated with this cave. You'll see some of the symbols later. And Bill and Steve are old friends from Steve's research days and for years. Keep on going. Okay. And then, so we had multiple generations. These two guys are related, and of course they worked with each other out there to tell stories and reinforce and check things with each other before they told us. Kaiser taught the volunteers the recording techniques, how we would, with minimal touching of the rock art, we would record the details. And we used a digital enhancement of the photos to help us with some of the details as well. This is kind of the sort of a standard flash look at some of the rock art in the cave. Again, there's another example of a mask from the roof of the cave, and the stippling. We used 2 mill painter's drop cloth to overlay the images, and then a Sharpie to just stipple in the images. So you get kind of the texture of the images shows up, and you don't have to touch it any more than once or twice. That's the recording technique there, and on the right there you see again what it looked like under a kind of a flashlights and standard camera flash. And again, there's John again looking at some of those images the first time he was out there back in 1996. You can see the color's a bit washed out, and the light is not too good back in the cave. When you do the digital enhancement on it, you have options to change the hues and the color mix to highlight a lot of different details. And so you see there at the top is the main panel, or the most striking panel in the cave. And this is about a 100-foot long limestone cave right next to a sandy beach. And this image has been stitched back together by Carolyn Merrill, who's a digital and photo enhancement specialist. And she has stitched the images back together to recreate the panel on the roof and enhanced the reds somewhat to make some of the details show up a little bit more, so that you get the the overview. You also see here that I said this was a Taquan AD place. You see the woodworm motif in the upper right on the pictograph, and at the lower left you see the totem pole from the Klawak Totem Park that relates to a clan story of the Taquan AD that links the Klawak Totem Park to the cave in a very concrete way. I just wanted to show some of the things that we did as a lot of people around Klawak think that little stick guy on the right is just a kid's drawing. A lot of people, Native people included, will downplay this as not important. But when you look at the ethnographic collections, and this is pretty clearly, the dimensions and the proportions are all very similar to some of the collections that you see around the country. One of the little benefits of the digital enhancement process was the first time John went out there, we went out there together, and he had a completely different idea of what that design was. At the upper center is the design as you would see it with a flash bulb. After some digital enhancement and reorienting the photo and rearranging your spatial orientations, you get some very different ideas, and I'll leave you to look at the pictures and see how that changes. John originally thought this might be a sculpin tail, and of course his idea about what it was after seeing some of the enhancements changed quite a bit. The second thing we did was another pit project at this petroglyph site out in Shipley Bay. That's the setting of the project. Boulders and over a space of about a half mile of beach. There's Yarrow Vara at the center and some of the other team members sitting on this biggest of the boulders there. This one was covered in etchings that had been obviously put on there over thousands of years. You could see layers and layers and layers of rock art just built up upon each other. And we had the pleasure of being there for 2 weeks under different lighting conditions and different rain sitting, different times of the day, to just sit there and watch the images come and go in and out of the rock. And it was a very special time to be out there. The rock is partly buried in the gravels that wash in and out with the surges. It's a west-facing bay not too far from Coronation Island. And you can see that line there is the line that it was buried to when we got there. We removed some gravel to see what was below. And you can make out some of the kind of faded images below the gravel line. But the ones on the top are still sharp and crisp and don't appear to get buried on a regular basis. Yarovara actually went to Cake and Ketchikan and Klawock to try and do oral history about this place, and didn't have a lot of luck coming out with any specific connections to it. It was suggested by an elder in Cake that these two figures represented the spirit world on the right and the human world on the left, and that the spiral was a connection between those worlds, and that's about as much as we got in terms of meaning, and we're still searching for ideas. If anybody has any knowledge of stories that relate to this place, so we'd be glad to record them. Just a few of the photos. Some of them were broken. This is a rock about the size of 2 bowling balls that was obviously broken by wave action on the beach. We managed to find both halves and put them back together and do a tracing of that. It's a little anthropomorphic or a human-like figure. Across the bay at a second location about half-mile away was another cluster that had somewhat different motifs. The spaces were of a different style, and the art was of a different style. Part of that project was teaching people about these places, and this is the setting of the Sutter Creek petroglyphs. This appears to be a much later set of petroglyphs that come from perhaps just the late 1800s. A woman that was out on the project with us actually told us that she found a journal entry from the 1870s of some cannery workers in Chican that said, we went out in the evenings with our tools and made drawings on the rocks over by Sutter Creek. And so some of these really may not be very old. But this was, again, the Passport in Time project, and we went out with free labor and we recorded these in as great a detail as we could. That's the one that a lot of people drop by this place. There's graffiti on the rocks nearby, not right over the petroglyphs, but nearby there's people's names etched into the rocks and that kind of thing. But the rock art itself is pretty much undisturbed. There's also a Chinese burial, a Chinese gravestone, Chinese cannery worker on a little island right near these. And there's a grave island in the mouth of Dry Pass that is immediately adjacent to these that used to have lots of graves on it that doesn't anymore. Then the next thing we did, and this was a much more ambitious thing that we did in 2004, we did a heritage expedition. Forest Service has a program where we work with outfitter guides to provide educational and interpretive opportunities through the outfitter guides. And so we worked with Sealaska Heritage and the 2 local tribes, Craig and Klawock, and we put together a project where we had people paid, tourists paid to get on a cruise, a boat, and come out and work on the project for us. And we had Native people there to help them interpret it. I see Debbie in the back of the room. Debbie and her son Evan were out on the project. Rosita came down. Dennis Nickerson from Craig Tribal Government was there. And all of us together recorded the site, and we searched the shores of Shipley Bay for other archaeological things that we might not have recorded before. And this was, this again is, I know this is a bit controversial, and it was not very profitable. The idea is here that the Forest Service, in working with the partner, can recoup some of the money and put the money back into future projects that result in historic preservation, monitoring, or working with tribes to do projects around these same kinds of sites. But actually, we took in about 600 times 8, and we spent about $22,000. So it didn't work as far as that goes. My hope would be that if this is something that people wanted to see happen, that someone else work up the opportunity, but the demand is certainly out there. This is some of the folks that were on the project. Again, Kaiser was there, and there's Evan Head and in the bottom left, and Dennis Nickerson in the upper left, and Rosita Worrell. Dennis again in the upper right, recording some of these sites. We worked with Alaska Sea Adventures out of Petersburg was the outfitter guide we worked with. And we did evening lectures on the boat. Rosita did a lecture on Atu and Tlingit culture. I did one on the archaeology of Prince of Wales Island. We had, this is Carolyn Merrill at the upper right is our digital enhancement specialist. She did one on digital photography and rock art photography. So we had a series of evening presentations, and the guests that were paying up to $3,500 a piece for this 8-day experience got luxury accommodations and food and wine and exposure to specialists and experts. And just a couple more minutes, almost there. We also, Jim Kaiser again did a little demonstration of how rock art is made, the process. We collected some rock from elsewhere and just did a little demonstration on the beach, so people had an appreciation of how much time and energy went into it. And we did visit with the permission of Sea Alaska, who's now the landowner for the old village of Chican, as a historic and cemetery site. We did visit the old site, and there's some pictures of it from back at the turn of the century. We were there today, and we photographed the ceramics and bottles and whatnot that were on the beach. And we did stop by On Your Knees Cave, which we just saw before, because this is about 15 miles away from that. So there was not much going on up there right then. They were just closing down that summer, and we went up so they could meet the archaeologists and talk to them about the site and what was going on up there. And that was it. We got really good feedback. This segment of the population, rich tourists that we were working with, were very excited about the project, and they really felt like an underserved public that didn't get the opportunity to see these things very often, and they were very excited about coming out and doing it and encouraged us to do it again. Like I said, the cost-benefit thing didn't really work out. I personally get a lot more satisfaction out of the volunteer projects where I work with teachers and bring them out to the sites, and you get more bang for your buck. The message goes out through the teachers to their students and other teachers, and that to me is more productive. But this was something we wanted to try, and in some ways it worked, and in some ways it didn't, and we haven't done another one since. So that's it.
I'd first like to acknowledge the accommodation and hospitality of the Tlingit, and in particular the Sitka clams. And I'm also very honored that the organizers of this conference invited us to make this presentation. Unfortunately, Chief Adam Dick could not be here. He desperately wanted to attend this conference, and he had health reasons that kept him from this, but if he was here, he would greet you with a halakesla. And that's the welcome in Kwakwala. And I also want to acknowledge Bob Sam. Shakanasta has agreed to help me in talking about some of the clam gardens that we observed in Sitka Sound. I'm going to tell you a story. It's a really good story. I've been very fortunate to be part of this. My partner, Mary Morris. Mary, could you stand up? Mary's been part of this right from the beginning, and it's not only a interesting story about an archaeological discovery, but it's a story about collaboration between elders and their wisdom and science, and so I'm very happy to be part of that. I'm a coastal geomorphologist, and Mary is a coastal ecologist, and together we work together to do habitat mapping, and we've done the whole British Columbia and Washington coastlines, and over the last 5 years have done about 10,000 miles of the Gulf of Alaska coastline with this habitat mapping, and it's brought us to some different areas, and so that's what I'll be talking about as a result from some of that work. I always like to get to my acknowledgments first, just in case I get the hook a bit early here. I'm not going to go through each of those, but these are the various groups that have funded this. It's basically been a all-volunteer project since 1995. That was when our last significant funding was, and of course, we did get some support to attend this conference, which I'm very grateful for. And this was not a journey that we made alone. There was a number of other significant people that helped us reach where we are today. And this is I'm going to go to the end of the story first, and then I'm going to start at the beginning. But the reason I'm here is because in 2005, we were doing our aerial surveys through Sitka Sound, and this is when we actually, oh, you can't hear me, Dad. Yeah. And this is actually when we saw our clam garden. And I put a map up here, and you can see where we're located relative to where we're sitting right now. And all this purple line that's on the map is our flight line track from our helicopter. And I'm afraid we may have woken some of you up in 2005 when we did this survey, because they're all done at low tide. And that's one of the techniques we use. We fly at the lowest daylight tides of the year. Those are typically in June and May, and sometimes July. And we fly only during the lowest part of the tide. So this is a low tide survey, and that's what's given us this opportunity to see these features. This is, let's see if this is actually a clam garden in Sitka Sound, and Bob's going to help me with maybe explaining some of what we're seeing here and who that might have belonged to and who created it. But they're boulder ridges at the low tide line, and then there's a sand flat in behind those boulder ridges. That's the area where the clams are typically harvested. I'm just going to go now. That was the end of the story. Now I'm going to go back to the beginning of the story. And this all started in 1995 in July. This is actually, I can tell you the day, July 15th, 1995. We were surveying up the northern end of Vancouver Island. And this is also called the Broughton Archipelago there, and we were surveying in the area of Echo Bay. That's what the Broughton Archipelago is, that island group by Echo Bay. And I also wanted to add on this is the village Guazdams. It's been an occupied village by primarily the Quiksutinik for probably 6,000 years or more, and it's right in the area that we were working. And early in the morning in 1995, this is what we saw. We saw these features. I'm trained as a coastal geomorphologist, and I'm supposed to be able to explain these, and I couldn't explain this at all. And this is what you're seeing here is a boulder ridge at the low tide line, and then a sand flat in behind it. And we didn't see one of these or two of these. We saw hundreds in the first hour. And I'll show you, just go very quickly through a few pictures to show you some of the different styles of these features. There's smaller ones. Again, you can see the boulders are very well sorted along the low water line, creating a wall and a terracing. This one's really small. It's only about 30 feet long and probably 10 or 15 feet in width across the shore there. And this is one of my favorites, and in fact, I didn't know it at that time, but this is a boulder ridge right along the shoreline with cobbles and boulders, and then a sand flat in behind it. And this is the one where we stopped to hover and take some detailed pictures. And I didn't know it, but this particular beach was going to figure prominently in my life for about the next 10 years. And I have to admit, I was possessed at this time when we flew over this. And this one is about 120 feet across, and it's about over 100 feet long. And I just drew a little sketch. It's showing the boulder ridge along the low tide line with a sand flat in behind. These boulders typically are basketball size or smaller, and they're pretty well sorted. And the sand flat in behind there it's typically made of shell hash. It can be fragments of the clamshells, but it can also be, a lot of it's made of actually the fragments from barnacles that are being shed off of the rock walls nearby. And when we went back from this trip, I thought, well, I'll talk to a couple archaeologists and I'll find out what this is, and you know, we can take this demon off of my back. And the first thing that all the archaeologists told us, well, they're fish traps. And we see fish traps from the air all the time. These are some fish traps near Bella Bella. And we knew they weren't fish traps. They are lower in the intertidal zone, and the morphology is very, very different. And it was very clear that these terraces were associated with a lot of clams. You can actually even see clam shells on them from the air. So we didn't find any help there. And we were able to map these. I don't know how well that's going to show at the back, but on this map we mapped over 350 of these features in a fairly small area of the Broughton Archipelago, and they comprised about 10 miles of shoreline, and the longest was over 1,000 feet, and most of them were in the order of about 100, 120 feet in length. And we got a little follow-on funding to go back there and look on the ground with an archaeologist, and I would say that overall the archaeologists did not embrace this idea that these were man-made features. It was certainly my theory right from the beginning. I'm the geologist, and I couldn't explain them by any natural means, and so it was easiest for me to explain them by man-made things. And I felt, especially since all of the rocks in there were sort of boulder size or basketball size or smaller, that that was telling me that people had moved them. The archaeologist, he never seen, you couldn't open a book and find anything on these features. So his explanation was that they were natural, but he didn't rule out the fact that they might be man-made. And after 1995, I call it the dark years. And we continued to contact elders in museums, various archaeologists, and we're striking out, and I did a lot of reading on my own. This one is a book by Robert Gallois, and the interesting part of this book, it's a catalog of all of the reserve requests that were made in the early 1900s for reserves, and if I've highlighted a lot of references here to clam beaches in there, and I'm just going to blow up one. Chief Johnny Scow of the Quiksutanick claimed the entire island, Bonwick Island, for clam beaches. And if you go through this book, you find hundreds of claims for sites that they wanted as reserves. And I'm pretty sure this was probably mistranslated. We don't have the Kwakwala translation of this. And anyway, Bonwick Island has 46 clam gardens on it. So that would be a reason why one might want to claim that as a reserve. Another book that I went through, this is Boaz's book, translated by Randy Bouchard and Dorothy Kennedy. And I was interested in the Quiksutanick, who are the band or the tribe that's in the area of where we found most of these. And there's references in there to the Nimkish people mocked one of the Quiksutanick boys because he was a clam eater and they were fish eaters. And they said, green stuff grows from your belly. And the boy went home, told his mother, they went back to Guazdams, and the Quiksutanick made war on the Nimkish. And the reason I included this, it's very clear that the Quiksutanick were very strongly associated with clams, and that's where we found the greatest density of these features. I read a ton of books about this area during the dark years here, and one of them was a life story of Billy Proctor. He's an old-timer that was born in the area, and he's a very successful commercial fisherman. He was a great naturalist. He observes things because he's on the land all the time, and he's what we would call local, a specialist in local ecological knowledge. But the thing that I found most interesting was he was a clam digger, and he had like many people out on the coast in the 50s and 60s, that was their cash money, and they dug clams to get cash money, and he'd had experience. So I wrote him a letter, asked him what he thought about him, and this is the letter I get back from Billy. That's a picture of Billy. And in his letter, he said, to the natives of this area, these are known as clam gardens and were formed over thousands of years digging clams and picking up the rocks and throwing them over the bank. And he was told this by elders when he was a boy. He's about 75 now, so you know these are elders that were living over 100 years ago in there. And later we found out the names of the elders too. And he actually built a small clam garden himself, which I'll talk about in a minute or two. So it took me 5 years to get to this point, and it felt pretty good, but it didn't feel quite right because I still didn't have any connection with the people who had actually created these. It just didn't feel like it would quite reach the end. And it took another couple of years to get introduced to the right people. And our friend Nancy Turner introduced us to Chief Adam Dick, Quaxastala, to Dr. Daisy Seaweed Smith, Mayan Elf, and Chief Kim Rakalma Cludisi, Aquiliqua. And Kim is the elected chief of the Qualicum Band. Daisy Seaweed Smith is the daughter of Jimmy Seaweed, who's one of the founders of the BC Native Brotherhood. And actually, Kim is the daughter of Buddy Rakalma, who is one of also the founders of the BC Native Brotherhood as well. And I have a picture of Guayasdams from the early 1900s, and I just want to point out a couple of the houses. This is Chief Adam Dick's grandfather's house here. This one with the Sitsiuri here is Daisy Seaweed Smith's great-grandfather's house. This is Chief Johnny Scow's house, and some of you may have seen that house because it's called the Sea Monster House, and it's in, I think, the Seattle exhibition in Seattle, so it may seem familiar. And what I also didn't find out for quite a few years later is that this beach, which was the one we stopped at, it's actually the great-grandfather of Daisy was chief in the ancestral village nearby here, Chief All Seaweed. So this was a time when things really started to come together. And I just want to mention a few more things about Chief Adam Dick Quaxastala. He's a Zwattanik from Kinkum Inlet. He's a hereditary chief, trained potlatch speaker, a very successful commercial fisherman, but probably one of the most interesting things from my standpoint is he was a tradition bearer, and he was hidden from the residential school system, and he never went to school. He's 75 and he's learning to read and write right now, and even from the time he was a small child, he would have to attend elders' meetings and go to these meetings, and it's somebody mentioned how they were beaten up in residential school for speaking their native language, and now they're paid $30 an hour to teach it. Well, here's Adam Dick, and he was hidden from the residential school system, and now he's one of the most knowledgeable people on the Kwakwaka'wakw culture. So it's kind of ironic. And Adam brings to this, as being a tradition bearer, literally thousands of years of knowledge and expertise through traditional ecological knowledge. And this was a big day for me, 31st of October in 2002. Would that be Halloween? Yeah, oh well. Chief Adam Dick called my friend Randy Bouchard and identified these features as Lochiwe, and it literally translates as place of rolling stones together. And they were used to create clam gardens. So I thought this was the end of the journey, but I was mistaken. And when we finally had the name of this, we could go into some of the ethnographic literature and some of the narrations that had been recorded by Franz Boas and Hunt in the early 1900s. And I put this up. I know you can't read it, but I'm going to have one section I'll bring up a little bigger. It's a fantastic story about the mink and the wolf. And the wolf has the power to make the tides go up and down. And the mink has stolen the wolf's tail, and he's holding it over the fire, and he's going, I want the tides to go down. And the wolf say, okay, I'll make it go down to the barnacles. And the wolf says, or the mink says, no, 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 I want it to go down further. And the wolf says, no, okay, I'll make it go down to the seaweed. And then finally, the mink says, no, that's not what I want. I do want the tide to go where the place of the edge of the sea where the stones are rolled. And you can see I've highlighted Lokiwe over on the other side here. And in Kwakwala, Lokiwe was also the reference to low tide. They didn't say low tide. This was their reference to what we would call a minus tide. So that was pretty cool. It was one of the graduate students at UVic, Quentin Mackey's graduate students found that. We put together the idea, I call it the all-volunteer army, but we put together an expedition to go up there in 2003. I'd never met Billy Proctor. We wanted to have the elders visit the sites and record some additional ethnographic information. Actually a film crew tagged along with us, and we really didn't know very much about this film crew, but they came and they brought a fancy high-definition camera, and that's actually been made into a National Geographic film on this particular project. And this is our team, Lokiwe. You can see Daisy, Adam, and Kim there. Mary, my partner, Randy Bouchard is in the blue blazer there, and the film crew is in the back to the left there. And I put the picture of the gumboots there because one of the challenges with a team like this is it's like, just like here, all the tides are early in the morning, and you have to get a foot inside of every one of those boots and get them out the door, you know, and the tide's not waiting. So it was an unbelievable trip. We got to visit many of the places where Adam had worked with his grandparents. This is where his grandparents used to have a summer camp, and he had helped build a Lokiwe at this location. He also was able to recall a song about the Lokiwe. It's called The Dogskin Story, and it's about 4 boys doing good deeds for their mother, and one of the boys is doing a good deed by making a Lokiwe for his mother. Following the trip, we learned a few other things. There was actually a published reference about clam gardens. It was about the Lummi Indians on Orcas Island, and this is actually a picture of the ancestral village was right where those 2 docks are. And this fellow Stern, Bernard Stern, back in 1934, he wrote this, that a description of a cultivated clam garden where the largest rocks in the clam bed were moved out to the extreme low water marks, setting them in rows like a fence along the water, and it made clam digging easier compared to what it had previously been because there's only small pebbles and sand to dig in after that. And the other thing that he identifies here, which was also true in the Kwakwakiwak culture, is that once you constructed a feature like this, you owned it. So that automatically instills stewardship of that as a resource. If you overharvest, you're going to be hungry. We found words in 2 other languages, Nuchalnath, which is the west coast of Vancouver Island, and mainland Comox, which is the east coast of Vancouver Island. So we found some other references to it. Mary and I also did a trip to Billy Proctor's clam garden in 2004, and we wanted to try and inventory how much time and effort and what his harvesting rates were out of this clam garden. And this is a picture of Billy did all the digging. He's 75 years old, and he did all the digging, and we were doing the measuring and the weighing of the clams. And Billy started this clam garden in the 1950s. He said it took about 10 years. And there was a small part that existed. He just made it a little bit bigger, and it's not very big. It's 30 feet by 30 feet total, and the part that he enlarged is about 15 feet by 15 feet, something like that. Not very big, but over 40 years, we went through all of his harvesting recollections, and we guessed that he's taken about 6,000 pounds of clams out of that clam garden. So, you know, if you're looking to create some wealth for your family and resources, these were incredibly good investments in time. You didn't have to put very much time into it and get a very large return. So that's why people would do it. And the other thing that we noticed in there is Billy was really getting ticked off at us because we were going too slow and his clams were sitting out in the sun, and we were measuring as fast as we could. And but when he put those back, it was just like he was planting little tomato plants or seedlings or whatever. Those were his clams, and he was taking care of his clams and putting them back. And so, you know, it really instilled on us about the stewardship that, you know, when you own these things, you really take care of them. One last slide, and this was a clam garden that we saw in 2004. It's only a mile from our house. This is on the beach view, and I took a friend of mine, Elder Tom Sampson, he's Sartlip, and his friend Earl Claxton, who's Sawat, and the other person that's in the blue there is Dr. Don Mitchell, Professor Emeritus of Archaeology at University of Victoria, and we went out to this beach. And I asked Tom, I said, do you know anything about this beach? And he says, well, this is where my brother clams, is this beach. And I said, well, what about this rock ridge along the low water line? And he said, oh, I don't know anything about that. And I said, well, we've been studying these, and we think it's from people over long periods of time, hundreds or possibly thousands of years, moving the rocks down to the low water and making this ridge. And it was funny, as soon as we said that, a light went on with Tom, and I have his quote here. Tom said, well, when we were clamming with our grandparents, if we were fooling around and not digging clams, our grandparents made us move rocks to the base of the beach. And so there's Tom who participated in the process, but he's about 75, and he was probably maybe 5 years old then. So it might have been 70 years ago that the wisdom was never passed over. He participated in the process, but someplace in there, the wisdom never got passed along. And so, and I'm hoping there might be some elders here, or if there are some people here that can go back and talk to their grandparents and maybe ask about this story, because there may be some memories there still. And I'm just going to make a couple of conclusions, and then Bob agreed to help me out here. But certainly the clam gardens indicate that mariculture was practiced very widely on the British Columbia coast, for sure. And we've mapped hundreds of sites, and I'm quite certain that there are thousands of sites out there that haven't been mapped. But and certainly in the Kwakwaka'wakw culture, when you created something like this, you owned it. So this was something you contributed either to your family or to your clan, and something you could pass down in its wealth for a long time, as Billy Proctor had shown. And to date, Chief Adam Dick has been the only living elder that I've been able to find with this knowledge. There may be others, but we were very close, and maybe losing some of this wisdom that had not been recorded. So I feel very fortunate. And now I'm going to put the Sitka Clam Garden up, and hopefully Bob can help me explain some additional. Oh, I just wanted to say one other thing. I am so grateful to the elders. They're very patient with me. I always say I'm a slow learner, and they were very patient with me in encouraging our work and being very tolerant of how slow we were to recognize some of these things. Bob?
I'll be very brief due to time. These clam gardens are a very new concept to the people of Sitka. These gardens are, for thousands of years, these gardens have been here. I'd like to say that these gardens belong to the people of Sitka. It's another indication of their ownership and stewardship of this land. When I first heard of these clam gardens, it was actually through my friend Jack Lorigan that's sitting here. He was so excited. One day when we were working at the office at Sitka Tribe, he came into my office. He was so excited about this new discovery. He just couldn't keep it. You know, his enthusiasm was well noted by the staff at Sitka Tribe. My job for the last 25 years, I've had opportunity to go out with the Forest Service or elders or times when I go out clam digging. Even when I say clam, I say clam. My mouth just waters when I think about these clam gardens. You know, and I was actually trained to actually go out and find sites out there that are on the land. And through time, I've been able to train myself to find like canoe haulouts. Oh, those canoe haulouts are so beautiful, and I always enjoy going out at a very, very low tide, early in the morning, and when I see canoe haulouts, I know that this is a very, very special place. And oftentimes I have opportunity to go onto the beach because I know something else. Those canoe haulouts tell me that there was once something there. So I'd go off into the forest and I'd find other things. And I'd find ancient midden sites and ancient places where houses used to be, ancient village sites, and these sites are all over this area, and another thing I'd find is fort sites, and I remember seeing rock walls like this. These rock walls are actually all over the place if you train yourself to look at it. I don't tell people openly about these places, you know, but because as a people who go out and enjoy going out digging clams, we actually keep secret. We don't want to tell people where our favorite clam digging areas are. You know, only our very special friends. But at a low tide, if you see these rock walls behind them, that's where they're at. And what's interesting about these clam gardens is when the tide comes in and the water breaks over the rocks, the water, the ocean refertilizes the soil, refertilizes the beach, and enriches the beach in such a way that when you go and dig clams on the beach, the more you dig, the more clams come back. That is a powerful, powerful technology of an ancient people that redefines us. That creates another definition. Of the professional people here. Oftentimes they would call us hunters and gatherers. This puts another definition on us as a people, and that we should be very proud of. We are farmers. And in a world of human civilization, farmers are in another category. It puts the Tlingit people into a farming society. That's a whole different role, and it provides a whole different view of us as a people, and we should be very, very proud of that. And another thing that I found out, a lot of these clam gardens were well known in British Columbia. They've known about them. Sitka was the first place that they found them in Alaska. So that's another thing that the Sitka people should be very, very proud of. And this will actually prove ownership of the land. Those of you that have been fighting for allotments, this is another tool that you could use in your use and occupancy of the land that you've always used. So I would encourage the elders of the Sitka Kwan, a few of you out there, go talk to your elders and ask them if they have the memories of how they used these places. I know that there are a few out there, and so this is going to have huge repercussions on your ownership of this land and how you utilize this land, and it will provide a lot of a tangible integrity of who you are as a people. And I'd like to thank John Harper for actually opening it up. It actually, talking with him on the phone and through email, it made me very excited and hungry for clams. So I have a new way. I have a new way because my friends won't show me their favorite places. I now have a new way to find them. So if you want to go out and find clams, come see me, because I know where a few of these places are. There's actually one right across the bay here. If you look at a minus tide, you're going to find them even in downtown Sitka. Within the boundaries of Sitka, you're going to find them. And actually, it's nature that takes the best care of these places, because when we go out in nature, we walk right by these places every single day, and we don't even know they're there. So to the elders of Sitka and the Sitka Kwan, thank you for providing this kind of technology. And since it's lunchtime, I'm kind of hungry, so thank you.
My name's Steve Langdon. I'm from the University of Alaska, and I apologize about circumstances with regard to time. I'm going to be giving a brief presentation associated with an extremely important, sacred, and special site to the southern Tlingit people called Canoe. Yesterday we heard from Bert Adams in one of his accounts concerning raven stories about raven going out to an island to get fresh water. This is the island for southern Tlingit people. And we're in the process through interviews with the descendants of and the current users from primarily the two villages of Cake and Kloak, but also people from those villages who've moved to other places such as Sitka and Juneau to establish this location as a traditional cultural property. And I'm not going to talk much about that federal designation because Tom's going to talk more about that. But what I want to talk about as much as possible is the deep, rich cultural heritage that is associated. This is a true fabric of cultural creations that flow across the entire template of Tlingit culture. What you're seeing here is a totem associated with those islands that is in the Kloak Totem Park later on. And I'm going to just, I'd like to mention if they're here, and my assistant and my co-investigator in Cake, Mike Jackson, and I don't know if John Rowan is here or not. Mike, if you could take, okay, thanks. This is where the Hazy Islands are located, north of the Forester Islands. And when I saw the map that Madonna put up earlier about areas where people can collect bird eggs, and some of the history, I was a little puzzled, but I'm not going to talk about that because people have always collected eggs in their time immemorial from this location. It's called Canoe, which means in Tlingit, far out fort. and as a far-out fort, it is administered by the Alaska Maritime Refuge of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm not going to talk about traditional cultural property. This is how, unfortunately, which I encountered, is how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service characterizes it. I just want you to look at the bottom there. Not the first part. It's a remote without anchorages or campsites. So there's beaten by frequent storms under winds. The rocks called hazy islands are seldom seen, and human visitation is discouraged to protect the birds and humans. I think that comes as a bit of surprise to the humans. They don't need any protection. They know how to take access to those islands. So that's a matter of some concern to me as well. They're about 15 miles west of Coronation Island, so they're truly out at the ocean. The landscape consists of 5 islets, and it is 4 are smaller, low-lying with dispersed grass and bare hard rock surfaces, and one is larger and rises much higher, estimated to be about 300 feet in overall height. The high island is steep and made of crumbly shale with ledges and caves in the walls. So what we have is that the hazy islands constitute a collection. Dekinu more than likely refers to this specific very high island, which has distinct characteristics, which I won't be talking about. It is a nesting site for numerous species of birds. Madonna went through a number of them. Most important for the Tlingit in contemporary times are the seagulls and the mures, from which they collect the eggs at different times. Puffins, as we also saw, are recognized as being used in the past as beaks for various different objects, including rattles. There are also sea lion rookeries on several of the islands and nearby to them proper. And consultants indicate that there are also harbor seals that are quite concentrated in the area as well. And in their discussions of it, the interviewees comment that the noise is deafening when going ashore to pick the eggs. One of the things about this place that you find in the consultants' accounts is that there are very special rules for coming ashore that are taught to young people. There are very special rules of behavior about how you are to conduct yourself on those islands with regard to speech. One of the things is that you are not to speak. They are speaking while you're there. Your job when you're on those islands is to take the eggs and to leave as quickly as possible. So what that means is that this constitutes an extremely special and what we would call a sacred place in terms of the kinds of rules for people's interaction with this particular place. So the Dekinu is part of the Raven cycle, and I'm certainly hopeful that this will show today, because I do want to honor the oral traditions of the people who have carried down the important cycles and stories with regard to this particular landscape and its significance for the people. So, volume permitting, hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
The story begins with the Raven tells the people from mainland that he would go out and get water because the people of the mainland needed water to survive on. And so this legend was told to me along with a lot of other legends as I was growing up. And being the only child of the family and not being distracted with all these here things that the young students or young children as my age get distracted. I was raised in the camping, fishing camp, and the winter camps away from the village, and we only came by dugout canoe to get supplies probably once a week or once a month. And so when the winter nights were long and days were short. A lot of stories were told to me over and over, and one of the stories was that where the raven wanted to bring water to the mainland, and there was only one place designated for water, and it was out at Hazy Island, and they called that in Tlingit canoe. And there was a little old lady that lived on that island that guarded the water, nobody else. She had a box, and in that water box was the water. And the mainland people needed water to survive on and to continue life. And so the raven volunteered to go out to get water for the people. And when he told the people that he was going out there, he says, I'm going to go to Canoe and bring water to the people. And the people responded, you're never going to make it. She guards it with her life. She never goes to sleep. She guards it that nobody else can have that water but herself. She doesn't share it with anybody. And Raven argued, says, I'm going to bring water. And so Raven went on his journey to Canoe. And sure enough, Anouk was there. That was the little old lady's name. And as he approached the island, Anouk was ready. She sat by her water. And Raven walked up to her residence where she was staying. And he says, I had a long flight, he says. I flew from the mainland and I'm very thirsty. He says, I've been walking around looking for water and I can't find it. And Anouk says, well, come on in, sit down. She opened up her box and she got a dipper and gave him a cup of water. And she closed the box again. She put her arm on it, leaned on it, and sat by it. And as time went on, Raven said, I want to tell you a story. Says, I'll tell you a story, and I want you to listen very carefully. So Raven kept on telling her story, went story after story, and after 3 days and 3 nights, on the 4th day, she started showing signs that she was getting tired. So Raven went and told stories, more stories. He went on and on and on. And towards the morning, her eyes would close automatically. Shut her eyes and he'd nudge her. He says, hey, Anouk, he says, wake up, I'm telling you a story. I want you to listen to me. And so Anouk would sit up. She took her arm off of the box. Now that was the first good sign, or the second good sign. Her first sign was closing her eyes. She couldn't keep them open anymore. When she took her arm off the box, and leaned, get comfortable so you can listen to me carefully. And so she did. And he went and told the story continuously. Pretty soon her eyes closed again. And he'd nudge her, wake up, listen to me, I'm telling you a story. It's not good if you fall asleep before I finish. She couldn't open her, she wouldn't open her eyes. Her eyes just shut, she couldn't move. Or she wouldn't move, he'd push her and try to wake, but she wasn't moving. So after the fourth time, he went and slid the lid over sideways. So here's a box that was covered. And he slid it over this big, far enough to where he can get his beak in there and siphon all the water he can hold. And all of a sudden he was getting to the point where he couldn't hold any more, and he was going to close the lid. And Anouk woke up and he flew to the smoke hole and almost got stuck because of all the water that he siphoned up, expanded his body, and the smoke hole shrunk on him, and he barely made it out of there. And as he was flying, or as soon as he flew out, he made a sound. Then the box became a rock, and the lid remained half over the box. And he flew, and as he was flying to the mainland, the drops that came from his beak became rivers, creeks, and so that the people in the mainland was able to get all the water that they could use, lakes, rivers, and that's how the raven got the water for the mainland. To this day, if you go out there, where it is, I have no idea. I've never been out there. But my dad said that when they went out there, they went looking for that. And in this one area, in the middle, I guess, of the island, is this box-like wall, and it's half full, and the lid looks like it's a lid. The rock is flat, and the box, it has water in there. When you take water out of there, it's pure, fresh water. It's not rainwater, it's a continuous, pure, fresh water out there. It's like a box. The lid became a rock.
Well, this is a sacred story about the raven cycle. There are various variations on it that are told, and I'm going to end my account just by talking about indeed, many of the consultants mentioned this story. It's crucial in their lives. This is a motivation for many to look for the rock box and a freshwater spring on their visits. Some said that the spring was located on one of the specific smaller islands known as Cook. And one stated that he had been taken to the spring by his grandfather, and after cleaning out the seaweed, fresh water indeed flowed from a box-like rocks on De Canoe. De Canoe has another layer. It's a Nastedi Atu. I don't, if there's Debbie Heddes here, she's Nastedi. If there's any other Nastedi people here, that totem pole that you saw in Cloak Park is also a part of the Nastedi heritage. There are many Nastedi personal names, the most important of which, or significant of which, is called Going Ashore on the Fourth Wave. They have a whole host of names that are associated with their relationship to these islands. There's lots more material that we're putting together to be able to make this application for traditional cultural property. And on that note, I'll end. Thank you for your time.
This is Tom Thornton, a professor at Portland State University, and he is going to talk about the anatomy of a traditional cultural property, the saga of Auk Cape.
Thank you. Boy, you good people have waited a long time, so I hope I don't disappoint. Are there any Auk Kwan people here? No? Grandchild? Okay, good. Well, I'm going to be talking about this place. I don't have the volume control there, but I guess that'll just stay up there. Traditional cultural property evaluation. This is one I got involved in 10 years ago, and I put this paper together with the help of Kathy Miller from Sea Alaska Heritage Institute and a lot of other people, mainly from Auk Cape or who have ties to that place. I see it as a microcosm of a much, much bigger issue, and that's why I wanted to talk about it in this session. If you're a social scientist, you're used to framing things in terms of problems, and I think the big problem is, as stated here, in an era when Alaska Natives face limited sovereignty, minority status, and continuing pressure on traditional lands and resources, how can important cultural landscapes be conserved? I mean, that's the big question. And the tools are really pretty limited at this point. And I think one of the reasons that they're limited is because of what I call cultural models. It's not my term, it's a term from sociocultural anthropology, but they're basically the cognitive frameworks that we use to interpret and respond to information and to events and to landscapes. And basically you have different cultural models of landscape that operate between natives and non-natives, or have historically, and have grown up through various regimes. And then even within cultures you have different models sometimes. And all of this is relevant to Auk Cape. But I sort of raise this issue because I think it's kind of the big question. What are going to be the cultural models we use to protect native landscapes? I think the ones we have are inadequate. And I'm not going to go through this, but this might be the tools we have now. We have traditional, what I might call in the case of Auk Cape, traditional cultural management, ownership, property as atu, as sacred, and stewardship at the clan and local level. That's a model. It doesn't tend to get recognized, but it's a model that still exists, even where land ownership doesn't. You have environmental impact kind of protections, which basically focus on saving flora and fauna, and they're not so concerned about people. You have things like subsistence regimes, which protect uses, but really don't say anything about particular landscapes. And so, you know, if you want to cut 100 million board feet in your salmon stream, they can still say to you legally, well, you can get them over here. And of course, that's not a satisfactory answer if a landscape is sacred to you. Then you have what was supposed to be the answer was the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, passed in the 70s, that was, you know, if you had a spiritual basis, a relationship with the landscape, that was going to protect it. But that law has basically been gutted by the United States Supreme Court, such that you get interpretations. The one that really killed it came out with the Go Road, if you're familiar with that, in the lower Northwest. But basically that the development on a sacred site does not violate the American Indian Religious Freedom Act unless it forces Indians into practices inconsistent with their religion. So that's the burden of proof. You have to prove that it forced you into other acts, and that's a lot to prove, and it makes it very easy to just throw that law out. So that's very, very discouraging, I think. Then, of course, you have archaeological laws, of which there are lots, and they do probably a reasonably good job of protecting physical sites, but I'm not going to comment on that. Then you have historic sites management, which is where traditional cultural properties fall. And then lastly, you have what you might call a compensation model, which is basically one where, like the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, we're not going to give it all back, but we're going to give you a part of it, and we're going to compensate you for the rest. And that is a model that's out there, and so it should be acknowledged. My time's probably up now. There's two emerging models. One is this traditional cultural property management system, and another is kind of what might be called the cultural sovereignty model, which simply recognizes that there should be a higher degree of self-determination in managing sites. This is Auk Cape. You're getting some schematics of the landscape I'm going to talk about now. It's complicated, obviously, how you manage a landscape, because in many cases you have multiple landowners, you have on native landscapes, you have multiple policies that govern it, you have multiple uses over time that are trying to be protected, and you have the question of who determines which values are going to be protected and for whom. And these are obviously big questions that surround all preservation and historic landscape protection processes. So in Auk Cape, and everybody knows where Auk Cape is. If you go in on the ferry terminal, it's basically that peninsula to your left as you disembark, and on the other side of it is Indian Cove. Well, the non-native value of this site that rose in 1996 was that they wanted to build a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and National Marine Fisheries Service consolidated facility on the property, and they were going to do a big land swap deal to do this, and the native community or some parts of it objected, and then the values came out. You know, from the Western standpoint, it was prime real estate. For the fisheries people, it was going to be an ideal site and an improvement for them. It was a large developed. For other people, it was a large undeveloped tract, one of the largest really in the populated areas of Juneau. Historically, it had been almost developed several times, but managed to be preserved and now had recreational trails and other things. And the Park Service actually had as a support facility for Glacier Bay at the site. The native values included that it was a traditional dwelling place, the site of their first village when they came to Auk Bay. It was a site that had been rich in natural resources, particularly herring, but also other plants and marine foods. There might have even been a clam garden there. I wasn't looking, but probably the beach is too disturbed. And of course it had graves, both shamanic graves, which are above ground burials, and then probably post-contact below-ground burials. And there was some continuing spiritual engagement by the Auk community. So the investigation was triggered by this facility. I was hired to do something called a traditional cultural property evaluation, and Rosita Whirl gave me the heads up on this. She said, well, you know, we're going to recommend you for this, so don't make any summer plans after the spring semester. And I'm glad I didn't, because they gave me like 10 weeks or 8 weeks to do this whole thing, which really isn't enough time. But I did conduct 40 interviews, a review of the literature, consultation with the appropriate sources, and then I wrote about a 50-page report and made a recommendation for eligibility of this site as a traditional cultural property. I didn't do any archaeology. The archaeology was done separately by Charles Mobley, and he published his findings, and one of them was that construction of this NOAA facility would likely obliterate any cultural resources in its footprint, and they wanted to put it actually near where the highest concentration of what they call CMTs, culturally modified trees, are. And culturally modified trees have a number of uses, but there was a particularly high concentration on one side of the Cape. All right, well, here were the findings. To my own surprise, because I'd lived in Juneau for quite a number of years and I'd never heard much about Auk Cape, but I found myself going by the criteria, recommending it as eligible as a traditional cultural property on the basis of these four things. The property is associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of the history of the community. The property is associated with the lives of persons significant in the past. And D, property has yielded or is likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. The one that didn't involve was the artistic one. So we had three out of four, and that was my finding, and I submitted it to the EIS, and that was 10 years ago. Now we have Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. But a little more on the findings and some of the people that were involved. Bob Sam mentioned canoe runs. One of the physical things that you could find at Auk Cape was this evidence of these yakudei, these canoe roads where people used to land. The whole place had a name that we had gotten from Cecilia Kuntz, Huanachi, and David Katzik, who was here earlier, was able to confirm that by going back to the archaeological sites taped made in the 70s from that survey that Sea Alaska did. And it encompassed not just the Cape, but the islands offshore and also the water intertidal areas on both coves. And the area also had an English name of Fairhaven, which was in the literature and on some early maps, because it was a fair haven, even for the second group of settlers. It was significant in 4 ways. It had been the original habitation site of the Auk Kwan, particularly the Big Dipper House, the Yakte Tan Hit, which is a branch of the Tlingit dog salmon clan. They came there and they saw the herring, they saw the good beaches, and they decided to settle in Fairhaven. And yesterday, the gentleman from the State Archives was here, and I had to dig for all this stuff, but one of the things he put up there was the history of Auk Kwan by Philip Joseph, who was a Tlingit elder, who wrote it down just to put it in the State Archive, and then he published a second version of it. But now you can get the whole thing online, and I had to go, somebody told me about it, I was digging around, it took me a couple of days of my 8 weeks to find that, but it was very important. And interestingly, the people decided to move, and they moved to what's now Auk Rec, the Auk recreational site. And he said one reason was because it had better beaches, larger beaches, although they had to clear them, is what I was told. But then the name of that town was Anshkaltsu, the town that moved. So the name itself tells you that they moved from somewhere else. Well, where did they move from? They moved from Fairhaven, from Auk Cape. So here it is, the original place in Juneau, and it's still reasonably well protected, and now it's the subject of a traditional cultural property evaluation. It was also very important for subsistence. One of the great losses in southeast natural resources, I'm not supposed to use the word subsistence, is herring. And this was a place right up until the 1960s that was very, very productive for herring. And I know some of the people remember when they put pounds in there for the herring pound fishery, but it was used for rendering oil. And this was a historic camp on the lower side here where they rendered herring oil. They also gathered eggs, and people were doing that right up into the 1960s, and they would kind of use the Park Service driveway to park and go down and get herring. But since 1980, it's been very, very depressed, and it's not able to do that. Another explanation for why they moved that I heard is that they were too close to the herring, and when they got big and they built more houses, it was considered a kind of a disturbance. One person told me that. The other thing was graves, and of course graves, to the extent that they're physical, are very persuasive to historic management circles. So those were documented by Chuck Mobley. But one of them, he didn't do any excavation. One of them was offshore on an island on a promontory, and that one was associated with a shaman. And so that was very important, and it made it a very different kind of landscape. Oh, and finally, it was a historic, as well as a camping place and the original village site. It was also associated with key events in history, including one story that was told at one of the early meetings about a man called Yiskalnach, a newly wealthy or newly rich man who had defended Auk Cape and the greater Auk Cape area against a Yakutat group. And the interesting thing was that one of the elders, a couple of them, had actually told the story at the scoping meeting about this consolidated facility. And when I began the investigation, the guy said to me, who was running it for NOAA, he said, you know, this woman told this really pathetic story at the scoping meeting about some guy who had defended, you know, he just didn't get it. His cultural model was, why is she telling me this story? What does it have to do with Auk Cape? It just seems to be some little piece of her history. But of course, why do people tell stories in Tlingit? They're essentially making a claim about their historical presence in an area. So that little story, which he described as pathetic, became very central to my investigation, actually, the Yith Kalnak story. So good that people remember it. One of the things you have to do is judge integrity. Well, the integrity was good in some respects and not good in other respects. The subsistence resources obviously were damaged, but the rest of the site was in pretty good shape. And then something else that was very important, and this is by way of advice for doing traditional cultural property investigations, is one of the most important lines of evidence turned out to be the record of defense of the property. This property had been defended by Tlingits since Yis Kalnach, which happened pre-contact, and probably people could take it further than that. But then Vancouver came, he dispatched Lieutenant Whidbey, they chased him out, he ended up at Point Retreat, which they named, I like it when the English name for events, like the Tlingits do. We all know Point Retreat on the end of Admiralty Island.
I like retreat.
And so that was another instance. Then I found records from the A&B. You know, the A&B used to be very careful about taking a stand on land use issues. They still are in many communities. But they wrote letters against development of the site in the 50s and in the 60s. And I didn't think I'd ever find this stuff, but people had it. And so you had this record of defense that went back hundreds of years and was very, very consistent about why the site was important and why it was used. So I would say more than anything else, even more than the physical evidence, I think to me this was critical, this record of defense of the territory. And this was just the latest iteration, basically. And then there were continuing uses, and this is Rosa Miller and her members of her family who took me out there and talked about particularly how they interact with the graves, and so that was very sensitive information, but it was obviously a big concern of theirs for having a facility out there. So now here's the question: denouement or irresolution? Well, what we have is either a really long denouement or irresolution. I finished my investigation in my 8 weeks. We had comments, but it was all done by 1997. Here we are in 2007, and even though the federal government agreed it was eligible to be a TCP, even though it was nominated over 5 years ago by Sealaska Heritage Institute with the support of Kwan to become a TCP, it hasn't made it yet. And this is what Kathy Miller was going to talk about, but she's taken it over. She works for Sealaska Heritage, and she says that they write letters. They say, we want more evidence of the boundaries. We want more evidence of the physical remains. They want more of this. They want more of that. And I said, well, why are they so fixated on this? And she said, well, I think the real fear, and I think she had good evidence to suggest this, is that when we open up the doors of TCPs, they're going to come flooding in. And because we know that there are records of defense and there are remains all over Southeast Alaska, and the concern is what's going to happen if we open up these floodgates. So they're proceeding very, very carefully, and I don't want to say they're trying to undermine the application because I haven't been close enough to it. But I wanted to tell this story here because I think the fate of Auk Cape, the saga of Auk Cape, is very, very important to these other investigations. And obviously if it goes through, I think it would set an important precedence, not just for Juneau people and protection of that property, but for a whole lot of other efforts that I know are underway to do similar kinds of nominations. So that's what I wanted to bring this story here. Oh, well, yeah, they did. I'm cutting it short, but here's what the mayor said about Auk Cape when they decided to move to Lena Point. He said, Auk Cape has cultural problems. So, that was John McKinnon. I think it was assistant. Auk Cape has cultural problems, so we're going to move. We're going to move it. And I got called a few names too for my report. You know, I was the guy who undercut, because the university where I worked was going to have a piece of this new lab, and they didn't want to drive to Lena Point. It's further out. But even at Lena Point, they're messing with some other sites. So that's part of the continuing saga. But they've actually broken ground there. And that first slide I showed is where they're breaking ground at Lena Point for the facility. That was in 2003. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the announcement is that 2 o'clock is the fishery session in the community house. And I'm part of it, so I'm going to move with you.